Hi, everybody, and welcome back to episode number 7 of Mapping Bigfoot. Tonight's guest is Astrid Willis Countee. She is a close friend uh, through marriage for me. My wife made the connection, and when I was discussing this episode, I didn't know where to take it after last month's episode. And Caroline, my wife, said, I think Astrid would be a great guest. And we got talking, and Caroline filled me in on her background a bit, and she used the phrase, "Astrid's probably the smartest person I know," which I won't take personally, by the way. I thought it was me, but apparently not. So I can even after that, I still decided Astrid was a good guest to have on the show. I've been knocked down a peg though. And I just want to fill you in on her background. She is a tech anthropologist. She's working in the changemaker space. She's currently a fellow at Climate Vine, which is an organization that connects climate professionals to help them collaborate and accelerate their impact. She's also a research associate at the Plenary, which is a civic imagination nonprofit that organizes events, conducts research, and creates guidelines to break down silos and advance systemic and cultural change. She previously worked in tech as a software developer and a UX researcher, in oil and gas as a data analyst, and in innovation focused nonprofits. These days, she combines her experience and passion to focus on change maker spaces where she can build towards new futures. She's always perpetually sleep deprived by her two tiny humans that she shares with her husband in Richmond, Texas. I know what the sleep deprivation is like. I think, after having a 1-year-old, I've lost measurable IQ points. Measurable. Just, I'll never get them back. Never. But without further ado, I can see Astrid in the backstage. She's cracking up. So this is a good time to bring her on because I think it already sets the tone for the show. I'm glad to have a friend on. I'm very comfortable and happy to have this conversation. I can't wait for you guys to come along on this journey with us. I'm going to bring her on, and then I'll jump into what the show I'm excited to cover. I think it's going to be an interesting show. So let me add Astrid to the show. Welcome,
Hi,
Astrid.
Scott. Hi, Scott.
It's
Thanks for having me.
so good to yeah, happy you're here. So good to see you again. We were talking a bit before the show, and for everyone listening, one of the things that Astrid and I kind of pre-gamed about was her background in anthropology. And one of the things that I want to know more about uh, from my experience with the Bigfoot Mapping Project is the people side. So, kind of flipping the script on Bigfoot and understanding why people believe, learning more about the woo side of Bigfoot and how it can be explained through anthropological terms, all these kinds of threads that really weave themselves through the fabric of the holistic view of Bigfoot. But first, let me throw the mic into Astrid's court and let her, I guess, give her take on our pregame session because um, I want to hear it from the smartest person in the room, which is Astrid.
Karen still thinks you're totally one of the smartest people she knows, so don't worry about that. But yeah, our pregame was great because I think we found the connection we were looking for. And I think that connection is actually quite relevant for so many things today. But it's really about what it means for us as humans to encounter something that forces us to question who we are, what we really mean, we fit in this like environmental ecological space, and also what distinguishes us from other things. And that sounds like it's not necessarily about Bigfoot, but I think it actually is, because a lot of, at least what I was seeing, because I did a little bit of Googling around just to see a little bit of what people are saying, is around why are they having these experiences, why are they seeing these things, why don't people believe them, It forces people kind of group together and say, I'm not crazy, which I think is a thing that I feel like so many different kinds of people could say right now. Like, I'm not crazy. You think I'm crazy, but I'm not crazy.
I
And
say that a lot when
why
I'm
would
talking about my hobbies. Yeah.
I know I've heard you say that one. And it's really related to, I think, where we've kind of fallen from this understanding of why humanity matters. So like our understanding of what humanness is not something we talk about much in our very technologically focused society. And so I think it comes up a lot. And these types of connections happen a lot. We talked a lot about different things, but
We
as you were
did.
saying about your missing IQ points because of your tiny human, having children is another, like, you start to watch what kids do and how they evolve and how they grow, and it's really hard not to feel connected to so many other things on this planet when you have that personalized experience. And I think that doesn't it's not surprising to me that there are people who are saying, I don't think that we're the only humanish thing here, and I want to hear more about what that means.
So that's a great segue. I think I alluded to it earlier. One of the things that, and I've said this on other podcasts and other shows, one of the things that surprised me and kind of ignited this interest in learning more about the anthropological side of the pursuit of Bigfoot and the pursuit of understanding Bigfoot is um, the conversations and the reports and the contents of those reports that come into the Bigfoot mapping project. Because when I started, I thought it was going to be more of a dry, logic based, evidence based pursuit for, you just go into the website, you fill out a report, you hit submit. I do analysis, I tell you where Bigfoot is. Really, when I started a few years ago, that's how I thought. I thought it'd be pretty transactional, right? And I was very surprised to learn that there are deep spiritual um, belief systems and I don't want to say assumptions, but methods by which
Can
people
you
fill the
tell
gap.
me can you tell me,
Sorry?
like, of, like, what some of them say, like, what kind of, like, how they talk about it?
Yeah, yeah. So for example, people in some reports they say that, Bigfoot gives them a feeling of peace. They can feel Bigfoot around them. And I didn't expect a report like that to come in. I saw a Bigfoot walk across the street. I saw, found a footprint. These kinds of things. But I get reports that come in and say, I was in the woods and I felt this resounding sense of calm come over me, and then I heard Bigfoot talking to me. Or then there's the complete opposite of that. It's when people feel just this uncomfortableness, and people think that it could be infrasound coming from Bigfoot. Like it creates infrasound as a defense mechanism or something like that, where they actually physically makes them uncomfortable. Then there are people that say that they share gifts with Bigfoot, so they'll leave apples out or stuff like that, and they call it gifting. So there's all these aspects of reports that and behaviors, both on the people side, what they're feeling in an encounter, I guess I'll call it, and also what they perceive or think they're what would I shouldn't say that, what their experience is how I'll say it. What they're reporting their experience is with Bigfoot. So I'm trying to understand that um through a filter of anthropology, if you will, maybe psychology,
Mm, mhm.
anthropology, because I don't uh, have enough knowledge on that side of the science world to be able to digest that really and apply it to the research I'm doing. I don't understand it well
Yeah,
enough, and I'd like to learn more. And that's why I'd love that you're on the show because based on our pregame, I think we're going to get into some great rabbit trails, and you can
Yes.
enlighten me
Yes.
on the hard science truth of, like you said earlier, if it doesn't repeat itself, it isn't real, versus the social sciences of like observation and what are all these
Mhm.
principles and theories, et cetera, that we talked about earlier, and how do they really apply to make this a more holistic project, and for me to have a better understanding of the people that are making these reports, why they may be saying these things, why what they may be experiencing, how to differentiate between somebody's perception and being able to pull facts out of it, all these kinds of things, right? How to learn more so I can do a better analysis.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to learn from
There's
you in just 1 hour on this show. That's all.
just an hour. There's so much going on there. I had not considered, people giving gifts and exchanging gifts. That's really interesting because that reminds me of, there's a Mexican holiday, El Dia de los Muertos.
Hmm.
Are you familiar with it? And you
Familiar.
build
Yeah.
an ofrenda. Okay, so you know what it's about. I mean, I can explain a little bit. I'm not an
You
expert,
can
but
explain it better than me, please.
El Dia de los Muertos is the Day of the Dead, and it's a day where you are honoring the spirits in your family and your life that have transitioned. So this is relevant because this is a different kind of context of what death means. In a very clinical Western way, death is final. There is nothing on the other side. But this is not just spiritual because it's not really about religion. It's really like a cultural understanding of you're not here on this side with me, you're on another side, but you're still with me. And this is something that actually exists in a lot of cultures. Like there's a lot of indigenous cultures that do this. There's a lot of African cultures that do this. You have these people who've already transitioned, but they still inform your life. And
Hmm.
on this day, you have this ofrenda that you create, and it usually has offerings that are things that these people would like. So maybe their favorite food, or maybe something they like to do, and something that represents that. So it's also symbolic. It's not just, you don't have to find like the dirt from their favorite beach or something. Like you can put something that represents that.
Hmm.
And it's like a relationship. So you're still in relationship with these people. And I think this kind of concept of this Bigfoot, it would talk to me, or I was leaving something and they give me something back. It sounds very similar to that. I wouldn't call those things non-factual, like they're happening. It may not be happening like in a clinical, scientific. We can put you in a lab and watch this happen again, and then observe all different changes, sort of way. But it's happening. And I did go get a real anthropologist name to tell you, who is Victor Turner. So Victor Turner has this concept, because I know this concept, but I don't remember who did it, called liminality. And basically, it's about being in between spaces. It's relevant in the context, like a lot of times, the way that you hear about it first is through rites of passage, which every culture has, and it's not always like the big stuff. It can be sometimes what we think of as like little things. Like I would say, this is not totally accurate, but I think this is a good example. Is like being a teenager is sort of a liminality space. You're not a little kid anymore, but you're not really an adult.
Hmm.
You can do some things adults can do, especially like once you get to 18, you can vote, and you can usually drive by then, and you can go to war, but you can't drink. And we have these weird kind of rules because we don't have, it's an in between space. You're kind of an adult, but not fully, not really. Still got to pay that high insurance on your car until you're 25. Like stuff like that. That is really, these are just markers that we're putting in the sand, but they're not necessarily tied to like a biological truth or something like that. They're not clinical. They're
They're not
social.
concrete
This
per
is a,
se, right?
yeah, like this is not like because you reach this age, you can now like pay this bill that you couldn't pay at 24. Like that's not the case. It's
Right.
really because we are trying to navigate this weird space and give you like a structure to come out of it into this what we call adulthood. And for a while, when I was in undergrad, because I was a forensic science major, I did an osteology lab, and I thought I was going to be like a forensic scientist in a lab somewhere, like doing all this stuff after death. So I was that person who was like, I know what bone this is, and I did that for a while. When you do that, you learn that as far as your skeleton is concerned, you are considered as sub-adults until you're about 29. Now, we don't have any rules in our culture that says that you become an adult over 29, even though biologically that would be true. So, like, this is what I mean by being a teenager is like this liminal space. It's not really, it depends so much on like who your parents are and what you can get away with and all that other stuff, like what you get to do. That
Hmm.
in between space is where things like this happen, where you can have this, I what they about I felt a presence and I felt peaceful. That happens. This is like where with cultures that have like shamans, sometimes this is where you can have the shaman was able to speak to my ancestor and give me a message. That's where that happens. It's also we show this a lot in our popular culture where somebody who's creative or artistic will utilize like and now it's more common as microdosing or will utilize some form of like drugs to get them to a different psychological space because this space is also considered very creative, very generative. Like you can get a lot of information and you can get a lot of new ideas out of this space. So this is a space I think most people feel like they kind of know when you tell them about it. But as far as like what this means in a larger kind of cultural framework, all of us have it. We apply it different places. I think the difference is that for people who are saying that they see Bigfoot, they're probably existing inside of other cultural structures that don't recognize that as like a possible space. So just because you went to the forest does not mean that you are not in between two worlds and you can have this experience. We don't recognize that. I think if the same person were in sort of near death experience, if they were like maybe very, very cold or something like that, and then they told us that, we'd be more likely to be accepting and be like, okay, you had an experience because we recognize that as that in between space.
Hmm.
I think that's a part of what's happening here. And so it's like when you're having an experience, when you have this concept, but maybe a larger kind of culture around you doesn't, then you have to look for others who recognize like, okay, you get it. You this happened to you too. You see this and other people don't. I think that's part of what's happening.
And I think I'm trying to learn and listen and digest as you go through these because these are new concepts for me, right? This and which is why I do this podcast to kind of push my boundaries beyond just pun. And that's a map pun, actually, right there. Pushing my boundaries. It's a map pun. And I'm very proud because I didn't even do that on purpose. Um, but I do this to push my boundaries. And as I'm listening to you, um, it reminds me of when you say you look for other people who understand your experiences, right? What you've had, you look for others. That is a really interesting insight because I think that's one of the things that's happening in the Bigfoot community. There's a schism, if you will, between people like me. I describe myself as like a flesh and blood camp, right? I'm a hunter. I'm a science background, evidence based, logic based, kind of a conservation biology minor, like tactile, show me it. If I see it, I believe it type person. Then, and I've had these conversations with people that actually surprised me too. There are people that are um, on in a different camp, if you will, that are like the kind of slang term is like the woo side of Bigfoot, right? Oh, you
Yeah,
know,
you said woo.
paranormal, it's Bigfoot teleports, Bigfoot does this. And I I don't want to say that I deny that's happening because I'd be inserting my personal bias into the bigger data sphere. However, um, I do not know how to interpret correctly those types of reports? How do I pull out these measurable things? If somebody says to me, I saw this is a real report from a documentary that I was in, A Flash of Beauty, their second one actually. Um, there was a witness that saw Bigfoot turn into a orange ball of energy or light and float away. And that is hard for me to swallow, right? Because I haven't seen, I'll be honest, right? Like I haven't seen a deer do that. I haven't seen a gorilla do that. I haven't seen a human do that. So I sincerely do not want to dismiss it as something erroneous just because I haven't experienced it. That would be really closed-minded. However, I I know that there are people that also fabricate things. Like it's tough for me to have that litmus test for, it's almost I've got to look at the witness just as much as the story,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
why I think tonight's show is very interesting because there are people that report these things for attention just as much as there's people that now have seen this and are full on big, believers that Bigfoot could be interdimensional or there's something paranormal or supernatural or super human, whatever you want to call it. There's something more going on. And if that's the case, I'd like to be able to have a good baseline for that. And I think that's where your expertise comes in to help me stay ground truthed and without um, inserting my bias, but also without, for lack of a better term, contaminating the research. I hate to say that, but like you can't. I don't want to take in things that are just false either, and I need to be able to understand why people report things and what evidence is coming in the different ways it comes in. So understanding humans better because they're half of this equation, um, Bigfoot being the other, right, is really I would say my weak point. I can go find animals all day. I can map migration routes. I can map hotspots. I can do density analysis. I can do, the list goes on, but I can't tell when someone's lying, or I can't tell
Yeah.
what cultural norms influence the way they interpret their experience. I am not well versed in that. That's where I'd like to get better. And I also think having a conversation about this will help kind of build a bridge between those two camps. So maybe we understand each other better because people that are really hard flesh and blood camp are like those people are nuts on the other side,
For wackos.
right? Yeah, and then the people that are open to paranormal um are, look at people like me and they're like you're not seeing everything. You know what I mean? So how can you not be open to this? And it's my response is I'm basing it on everything in the textbooks I've read, everything I know from my science background that I that's what I have to go by. That's my education, blah blah blah. So that's a long-winded way to say I want to be more open-minded. I want to understand a little
Well,
better about the human side of it.
I think I have some things that might help you with this because I feel like you are, at least as you're saying it, like you're struggling. You don't want to be dismissive.
No,
It's just you don't have tools for that. I can tell you a few things, which is one, anthropology as a discipline has this exact problem when it comes to humans. So, in general, there's I think it's more detailed than this, but the American version of anthropology has four pillars: the cultural, the biological and physical, archaeology, and linguistics. And in some universities, like now you can even just Google and see it, there's been a split between the biological anthropologist and some of the cultural anthropologists because they can't see eye to eye on this human animal and say that what you're doing is actually what I'm doing,
mm,
even though anthropology is supposed to be the study of all humans. So this, I think, it makes sense what you're saying. Like, it's not just a you thing. It's like your personality. This is, I think, a schism because I would say the general concepts in anthropology around things like are science is a system of knowledge. It is not the only system of knowledge. And there's this very important concept of trying to have some sort of, it's hard to say equality, but trying to give as much space for other systems of knowledge to be as informative to your question as possible. That is really hard because science, as you know, has its own dogma. It says if it's not science, what are we talking about? So it's hard to hold this space and also be like a practicing scientist because there is this like what science actually is you use the scientific method. Like that's science.
Right.
Most people who call themselves scientists aren't actually using that method. They're using things that are based on that method. So what happens is that you build a dogma around I'm a scientist, you're not. That means I do this, you don't. It makes it hard to have conversations like this where we're saying, well, what if this could happen? Because it's like, but we don't have data for that.
No,
That's
and
the
that's where I
science answer.
struggle. That's where I
Hmm.
struggle. I'm
Yes.
like, and I've cracked the joke before. I'm like, and I think I don't know if I've shared this with you, but I think I've seen Bigfoot, right? I had an experience where maybe
No,
this
you
is a
didn't
good
tell me.
analog.
I think you told me you saw it, but you didn't tell me about the
I didn't share
experience.
the story. So
Mhm.
in quick terms, I think I saw Bigfoot. I'm pretty 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 sure, as sure as you can be without shaking hands, right? So um it turned up and ran away from me, and that's the part of my story that I want to highlight is it ran, it didn't teleport. So I say that all the time. I'm like, well, I saw Bigfoot, it didn't teleport. So to me, why wouldn't it? If it can, you know what I mean? If they all can, why wouldn't it just be gone? Um, so I struggle
Oh, I see what you're
because
saying.
that's my experience, and that's my frame of reference and my data point, and then I'm hearing the other things on the other side of the fence and other people's experiences. And really, I'll say this a lot through the show. This entire show is my effort to learn to take in evidence and reports in different forms without even having that thought, even if I don't say it, because that's how I'm going to get to the truth. And that's the journey I'm trying to stay on, is getting to the truth. Um, so with that said, um, one of the things that I had a question for you on, that we talked about in our pregame was like, um, we've talked a lot about how I am science based and I don't have that necessary belief on the paranormal side. I'll stop calling it the woo. I'll refer to it as like paranormal, because woo to me is kind of like dismissive. It's like woo, like
Yeah, because you always your
it's
voice has to go woo.
yeah, it's a little sarcastic, right? So I'll call it paranormal because I know there's um that's probably a more accurate term anyway. So w- what anthropological concepts explain the human race's fascination, perhaps, and the belief? So why do some people have that belief, and why don't others, perhaps? Or what about the human condition or the human experience, human history? What what helps people make that leap, right? In the study of humans, what can explain that?
The short answer is culture. So, I, I have a book. I haven't got a chance to finish reading it. It's called The Incultured Brain. Because the truth
Mhm.
is, what makes up our reality, like what we call reality, is like our physical experience of it, the environment that we're in, but also our ability to process that and give it meaning. And that's culture. And so if you come from a culture where there are supernatural beings, like that's not a question mark. That is possible because it is. it's possible for you to see supernatural beings. It's not even a question.
Mm.
If you come from a culture that says if you see that, you have a mental illness, then even if you think you see it, you're probably going to tell yourself that can't be what that is. It has to be something else because you have an instruction, whether you, most of the time, you're not going to be conscious of it, about how to sort things in your world. The best example, which is like, I think it's like a kid example, but I love it because it made sense to me even as a kid, is in the movie, the Disney movie Pocahontas. There's a scene where she climbs to the top of the tree. And I don't remember who asked her, but somebody says, "What do you see?" Probably the tree itself, because I remember the tree was her grandmother. She says, "What do you see?" And Pocahontas says, "I see clouds. I see strange clouds." Now, what she was looking at were the sails of the boats that were coming into the bay, but she had never seen a sailboat. So, what she described is what she knew. She knew things that are big and white and billow in the sky are probably clouds, but they're weird looking clouds. Like that's a version of like that's because of the pattern she was taught. It's not that she doesn't have a belief in sailboats. She doesn't have a model for that. So
Mm.
part of I think what you're saying is really about, were you exposed to ways of knowing the world that include this as a real option? That's one part of it. And then even if you weren't, like growing up, have you had experiences, built relationships with people who do see it as an option? And can they help you start to shape a model for that? That's another part of it. This comes up sometimes when, like when I was doing my graduate work, a lot of the stuff you read of what the older kind of like established ethnographies at first. And so that's when some dude, usually European dude, goes someplace into the world and they're there for a long time. That's how they came up with ethnography, because they figured out like, I'm here, I might as well take notes and like do science or something. So because they're there for a long time and they're participating in things every day, there's this concept of going native where you become so used to their culture that you don't even use your own culture's systems anymore because you know what they're doing. It makes sense to you. You build a map for it. In psychology, they call this a cognitive map. So your mind has ways, connections. This comes up when you have like traumatic brain injuries, for instance, and you have to rebuild that. But it also is around symbolic things too, because like as we were talking about in our pregame, we're symbolic creatures. We need symbols which encode information and tell us things. So just because the symbol exists doesn't mean it means the same everywhere to everyone. It might mean one thing to you, it might mean something else to someone else, and you still will have a hard time meshing that together without some sort of cultural framework that tells you what to do with it. So the reason why it can be really hard is because you need those things to mix together to give you the language and the ability to kind of, in a way, like open your mind to it. Because there are things like you could say the same thing about what we consider hard science. Most people have never seen atoms. Most people. If you're a scientist, you believe they exist. Like that's not even a question. But like you don't check and be like, there it is. I see it. It's right there. Most people, if you looked at elements in their structure, they wouldn't recognize that. They just believe that when you say this is the ring, this is what it looks like. That's what it looks like. That's a belief. They don't see it that way because they says based on observable evidence that they can then replicate. But most of us aren't doing that for every aspect of our lived experience. We're not saying like, is this really how microwaves work? Is this really how radiation? We just trust a process that says if it was peer reviewed and we have decided that it meets the criteria for certain theories, we're just going to go with that. That's still a version of belief. It's just based on a different set of steps. That
Mm.
same logic that gets us there is the same logic where someone in another culture can say, I'm sick, I need to go see a medicine man, and we might have to excise an evil spirit, which is following me. And for somebody who's not used to that, they're like, well, that's not why you're sick. And like, yeah, that is exactly sick. You don't know. And that sounds like they are rejecting all logic, but there is a logical system that got them there. It doesn't mean that
Mhm.
they don't believe that they need to take medicine, but what it can mean is that they feel that it's not the medicine that cures me. It's actually that removing this evil spirit allows the medicine to work. You
Mm.
can't prove to them that that's not true.
No.
Just like they can't prove to you that you need to remove an evil spirit. So there's always going to be an element of belief. And that I think it's harder when you are, because your scientific training doesn't give you that. There is no such thing as belief. But it actually is a part of what builds your ability to trust science, is that you have to at some point that if you know what you're doing and a bunch of other people agree and we can try it on our own and see, I guess it works, and that's true.
Mhm. That is where I'm coming from, the science side. And what I'm trying to understand is another one of the things, like, I think it's a good time to bring it up that we talked about in our session before the call was uh, like when we look back at the history of Bigfoot and historical reports and the I hate to use the word, but the lore of Bigfoot or the mythology of Bigfoot and the oral history of Bigfoot that's been passed down generationally and from family members, etc. What I struggle with is separating the influence that this mythology has had. Are they repeating the myth that they in their experience in their report, or is that their experience? How do I tell if is what we think a myth actually truth? Those lines kind of get blurred in the Bigfoot world, and we you mentioned earlier, it's like one person thinks they saw Bigfoot, another person thinks they saw a Mothman, another person thinks they saw a Dogman, another person thinks they saw a lizard creature, or so
Mhm.
all of this is rolled up into this complicated ball of different threads, and I'm trying to pick at it to get to uh not make it fit, but to try to get the factual information out of it, right? So how do I look at it through the best lens uh while keeping those things in mind?
Yeah. I would tell you what I would do, because I can't necessarily say it's the best way, but because I kind of live in this in-between space with where people are usually scientists, but they also have some exposure to something that's a little bit less hard science.
Mhm.
This is what I tend to do. If this is cultural narrative, there is a logic framework for it, a cognitive map for it, and you may not like map, like you may not Google and find the map, but what you probably will find is this this is something that you can research itself, not necessarily the particular experience, but where does this map to? Is there a particular indigenous group that maps to this type of story? Is there a relationship between, because I think a lot of times in this kind of, like we were talking earlier about that liminal in between space, there's a third thing there, that it's not necessarily the proxy, like that might be more of your understanding, that might be their understanding, but it is in the room, so to speak. So if there are people who are saying, I see Bigfoot and it tells me something, there are cultural stories about something that shows up to tell you something in all kinds of cultures. It
Oh,
could
oh,
be
yes.
Bigfoot,
In
it
indigenous
could be all
cultures,
kinds of other things. Yes.
this
And
is
I
a
would try
big
to see,
theme. Mhm.
yes. And this is what I was talking about. Like, it's almost like a cultural imagination. Like, there's a different type of cultural imagination there. So if someone's telling you stories like that, I would try to see, like, well, where does this possibly come from? And does it map to that? Because the likelihood of it being more quote real is higher. It means, because there's also this part. it's not just the individual and their experience. It's about how you make sense of it in community. And we all have multiple levels to identity. We're not just one thing. So, whomever this is, whether they even fully understand it or not, they may have a connection in their own identity that makes that understanding make sense and possible to them. So when they encounter something, they reach back there for the making sense. And if that is what they're doing, then there is going to most likely be some documentation of this is where this comes from, this is what it relates to, these are all the different peoples who believe in the same sort of thing, and that will give you a model. Because what you're saying is you don't know what to do with it. You're like, okay, well, I don't want to say you're lying, but I have no idea how to tell if it's truth. And
Exactly. Exactly.
if there's some sort of model of how this makes sense, I would say there's a greater likelihood that they are relaying a real experience to them, like something that they actually feel and something that they tell you happened, not just a sensationalized. Because this is actually a good segue into what we were talking about with zombies, because like zombies are an aspect of a real cultural experience that gets sensationalized. Like in a lot of the media around zombies, they eat people's brains and their body parts are falling off, and that is not part of the like cultural imagination where zombies originated in Haiti. That's not what a zombie is. So if
Hmm.
somebody in a similar context was like, I saw this zombie was eating my brain and it was drooling this blood, like I would question that because that's not that seems more like you're searching for something to explain and you're calling it a zombie. Not that you truly have this belief in zombies that's based in a real cultural explanation that is part of your identity and the way you live your life, and you really believe you saw a zombie. That is a very different place. You see what I'm
Hmm.
saying?
Yeah, I do. So that kind of leads me to another question, which the similarities between Bigfoot sightings, like the reports, it's amazing. Like, and people point to that as evidence. You know, this person's report, they saw this characteristic. It had a pointy head. It was this tall. It was this color. It was doing, you know, it was walking a certain way. And you touched on pop culture earlier, or I guess pop culture. It's how do we know that their brain isn't filling in the blanks, you know, as they're defragmenting their experience. And this is probably going back to your neuropsychology background or your psychology background. How do I like I'm not going to I can't change the report, but I need to understand how this narrative from pop culture, all the TV shows, all the illustrations, all the cartoons, all the podcasts. I mean, look at my logo up there, mapping Bigfoot, right? I've got two on the screen, and it reinforces what people think Bigfoot look like, right? So, um, how do I know that they're not subconsciously pulling that into their experience, you know, and it's skewing the data set that I'm trying to work from, um, or is that really what Bigfoot looks like, and that's why it's such an icon? You know what I mean? Like, how do I gauge
Yeah,
that?
I do know what you mean. I do know what you mean. As you were talking, it made me think of there's a similar concept with dragons. There are several cultures that have an ancient belief in dragons, and they're similar. And it's like they how are they similar? Because we
Yeah,
wouldn't
yeah,
say
exactly.
that dragons are a real thing. Um, so I would say your answer is how do you know? You don't know because minds are that is what your mind does that. Everybody's mind does. Like actually in my psychology book, there was this little test and it was like a dot on the screen. Oh, sorry, this is a book. So a dot on the page and there's this little plane and it was just like a certain distance away and it told you to take the book and slowly move it like further and further away from your face, staring at the dot, and the plane disappears. And that's crazy. And then they explained that due to the structure of your eye, there's actually a blind spot because of your optical nerve, and your brain makes up what's in the blind spot. So your
Yeah.
brain is literally doing this all the time.
Yeah, it's a
And
blind
in
spot where
that
your
one
optic
little
nerve attaches to your eye, right? That's what you're talking about?
right,
Yep.
yes. So like your question of like, how do I know their brain is filling in the space? It's 99.9% of the time we're probably all going to agree with what it fills in with. But there's
Mm,
always going to be the chance that it's filling in something else. Because that is how your brain works. So the question of how do you know, it is happening all the time. So you can't really utilize, there's not a 100% fail proof like if it was this then this. That doesn't really happen, especially when you start talking about biology. And I would also say, like, to your earlier point about trying to find a way to bridge between the one side and the other. The more you learn about neuroscience, the more you realize you can't be sure of anything, because our brains are amazing and in some ways unpredictable. And you can't discredit things like how trauma affects the brain or how
I was
stress
just
affects the
thinking that. You read
brain.
my mind. Yeah.
It's just there is no like objective version of another person that you can be like, well, let's go check the record to see if what you think you saw is what you saw, because there just isn't. There's only a actual like subjective experience that we can only get through the stimuli of what we can perceive of what they can give us. That's all we have. So that plus like the other thing that always makes me more empathetic in general is when you learn about quantum mechanics and how crazy that world is, and it's like literally underpinning everything. Then there are many more things possible than what you feel like could be possible, because if that's happening, like the idea that you can be a particle and a wave at the same time, like what do you mean until you observe it? How is that a thing? But that's science. And you can have two things that are far, far apart, but they can affect each other beyond the speed of light. Like you just said that you can't go. So that's the hard sciences. And if we can deal with that, then we can deal with like, I saw this
That's a
thing
really
and it
good
did
point.
something.
It's a
Yeah,
really
that's
good
what
point.
I mean. That's what I mean when I say science is its own dogma. You can't tell a scientist that usually because they don't want to accept that, but that's, look, we trust that. And then, there are physicists who are saying we basically live in a simulation anyway. So then what are we doing? And it kind of makes me think of that scene in The Matrix where Morpheus is like, what is real? How do you define real?
Yeah.
That's a good point too. Like, how do you define real? Because we can't all be. It's actually quite a miracle that we even agree as much as we do. If you take all those things into account, like the fact that we can kind of be like, yeah, the grass is green and the sky is blue. Like, I don't know how we're doing that, given how different brains are. It's just
That's
so
a
I
good
think
point.
there's a lot of space. Yeah,
So I
there's a
mean,
lot of space there.
maybe that's why Bigfoot is still undiscovered. We've managed to agree on the color of grass and that the sky is blue, but there's so much. I mean, it's really a good analogy. There's so much debate on what Bigfoot is, um, and that's really the driver for why I'm asking these questions. It's like, how do I want to get to the truth. I'm curious. I want to figure it out. And I know everyone else that at least listens to this podcast and has some kind of interest in Bigfoot wants to understand the mystery, wants to really know, okay, is it capable of these things that people say? Is it a spiritual messenger like people think? Is it just a really smart great ape or primate or another species, another super clandestine human species that's really, really, really good at evading and living on the fringe. There's so many different ways to slice what Bigfoot is, and I think that's why so many of the principles or the facets of anthropology that you're describing really apply in a very interesting
Oh
way
yeah.
to the study or the search for Bigfoot. And we were talking before the show, and it's like, Bigfoot in a way forces us to turn and look back at ourselves. And that's what, to go all the way back to the beginning of the show, that's what really inspired me to have you on, is realizing this by accident, just by, the things that are coming in, the people I'm talking to, realizing that there's been a culture or a Bigfoot religion that has built itself around this enigma, right? It's people really believe what they believe, and they are uh, dedicated and committed to it, on one side or the other. And I think the one thing we can agree on both sides is that, we'd like to know the truth, and whatever the truth may be, right? Everyone's truth, like, could be different, right? So, but we'd like to have something that resembles an answer. And um, I didn't
I think
understand
it's sort
how
of like,
complicated it is. Go ahead. Yeah.
Scott, did you ever read, or I guess you can't technically read them, but did you ever have those magic eye books like when you were a kid where you have
Oh
to
yeah.
look at
Oh
the
yeah.
little image? I think it's similar to that because it's like once you see it, you can't not see it. Like you look at it, you're like, it's right there. And other people are like, no, I don't, it's right there. They have
Oh,
to, it's like their brain has to get there.
yeah. You just made me think of something. And maybe you can, if you can, if I'm putting you on the spot, please let me know. But um, when you mentioned those seeing eye, I guess I'll call them the puzzle books, the 3D kind of, you got to cross your eyes a little to see the answer. One of the things that I notice, and it's gets reported a lot, and it luckily it doesn't really make its way into my project, but I see it in a lot of forums that I go read, is stuff that is obviously pareidolia, where people are seeing faces in inanimate objects like shadows, or in a tree stump or thing. It's clearly, when you look at it objectively, it is not a Bigfoot, but the person that saw a Bigfoot. You know what I mean? And that is like, I can look at that and say, okay, that's, clearly, or it's just not detailed enough. Like they took it with their cell phone camera from 100 yards away. What are you really going to see? Maybe you did see something, but that's not evidence because it's a pixel. You know what I mean? It's just a bunch of blurred pixels. So pareidolia is an interesting phenomenon because people see faces and they see Bigfoot and they are looking to see Bigfoot, and then their brain tells them they saw Bigfoot. You know what I mean? So that has impacted, I would say, the community as well, and it's reinforced a lot of people's belief.
Science as we know it has been around about 400 years. Like we're talking about like enlightenment and stuff to about now. It's about 400 years. Humans have been around about 300,000 years.
Mm,
So this means that we had to make sense of our world. I mean, there was versions of scientific inquiry and stuff before, but it wasn't formalized and it wasn't structured that you could rely on in the way we do. So we had to make sense of our world prior to that. And it wasn't just religion. I know that a lot of times people say we just had religion. It wasn't just religion. There were many other ways that all kinds of people came to have knowledge that we are finding out how accurate it is. Like people like 10 years ago love to talk about them when we're able to so accurately predict the astrological and cosmological alignments all the way up into recent time. Like we don't fully understand how they did that. There was a culture I remember reading a book about called the Dogon. They are super interesting. But this, like when you're talking about how can you parse what is true, their whole like cosmology, which is something I learned. This is something I learned in graduate school to start to look at things at that level. Just because you are accepting that there may be something further to be investigated is not the same as a blanket statement of I just believe that this must now be a full truth in the same way as other type of data that I can test.
right.
That's not the same thing. to your point about people who are seeing the Bigfoot face. So
Mm.
so some of this is actually a scientific phenomenon because I remember watching a video in undergraduate when I was a psychology major. It was a video, and it's two teams and they playing basketball. You're just watching them play basketball, and then after the video's over, they say, "Hey, did you see the gorilla?" And we're like, "What
Mhm.
do you mean? There's no gorilla." And then you rewatch the video, and there's totally a person in a gorilla costume who walks out and turns and waves. You're like, "How could I miss that?" And they're like, "Because your brain said, 'Let's watch the basketball game.' So you just filtered out the stimuli that you didn't want to see." And I think in the same sort of way, the same thing can happen when you are looking for something because we're also mapping patterns all the time. So when you're looking for something, you're gonna find it. You're gonna be like, "It's right there, it's right there, it's right there, it's right there." So this is just how our brains are built. And that's part of the, you can say, problem. It's part of the bigger question of what does truth look like? Because
Yes.
what is enough to say there's truth to this? For some folks, they're already there. They don't know what you're waiting on. They're like, "We've been telling you." I think
Mhm.
this is actually a really good part to bring up, and we talked about this a little bit in the pregame because I did do a little bit more putting together some stuff about zombies. So
Mm.
this is
Mhm.
all going to be research based, and it covers, I think, both sides of that equation you're talking about.
Okay.
So in the 30s, Zora Neale Hurston, she went to Haiti and she did a lot of research. This is like ethnographic research where you're embedded in the culture, learning about all kinds of things about Haitian culture, about voodoo as a religion, and therefore learned about zombies. So I think most, especially like in the West, would say a zombie isn't a real thing. It's a supernatural being. But voodoo, this is an actual thing that can happen. It's not a question of you became a zombie or not. Like zombies are real. That's not a question. So for Zora Neale Hurston, she didn't, in her conclusion, she didn't say, "I know they're real. I know they're not real." She didn't approach it that way.
Mm.
She basically up kind of like a catalog of like, this is what I observed. This is what people say. This is what they believe. And I wrote down some of what her conclusions were. So her conclusions were that she observed that zombies were a part of the religious and spiritual practices, and that they symbolized a spiritual consequence, and they
Mm.
were a part of like a way of social control. So I think social control in the same sort of way as like there was a form of way of being in the Victorian era where you acted a certain way, you dressed a certain way. That was social control. She was saying this is similar. She said it reinforced morals and ethical codes. And she said that there was an intricate cosmology that's a part of voodoo as a religion and a spiritual practice that connects the body and the spirit together. So I think that's
Mm.
important to understand because Western culture does not recognize that as a connection. That's like if you're religious, you might believe that, but not just as a part, as like a product of the culture. We don't teach that the body and the spirit have a connection. We might say body mind. Maybe spirit is like a little bit more like you would say woo woo. But body
Mhm.
mind we believe, but not necessarily spirit. And she said that it can be linked to a metaphor for enslavement and dehumanization and the loss of agency that echoed Haiti's specific history as being uh, an island or on an island where they were the most of the people there were forced into slavery, going through their own revolution and dealing with consequences for them having a revolution and trying to find freedom because the one of the aspects of voodoo is that although this particular religion, which I would put this in the same kind of context as like cultural framework, as though this religion had a space for voodoo, oh sorry, for zombies, it was also the same place that during the Haitian Revolution, like this is part of where resistance came from, this building of that inside of an entire people came from, is their belief in voodoo. So she did speculate that there might be a biological or pharmacological reason why people became zombies,
Mm.
but she didn't know for sure if that was the case. And she didn't want to, I think what she was also trying to do is be careful to not remove this very deep connection to an entire spiritual and cultural understanding of how to be in the world. Because basically, being a zombie meant that you were almost like untouchable. Like something happened and your soul got snatched. And now you're like a shell of a person walking around. So that's dangerous. You don't want to be a zombie. There's a reason why you're a zombie. And then you can be manipulated and controlled. And that wasn't the case. Then in the 80s, Wade, who's another anthropologist, he went back to Haiti, and he's also an ethnobotanist, so somebody who learns about the plants and the different types of plants and flowers that indigenous cultures use for all kinds of things. So he was like, okay, I want to go investigate what Zerona Hurston was thinking and approach it from a scientific perspective and see if I can find this possible biological pharmacological reasoning for zombieism. And he did. He went and he found that the sorcerers that were, quote, creating zombies, they usually were kind of seen as doing this. If you became a zombie, it's because you did something wrong or you found an evil sorcerer and they did this to you. That they were using in their like powders a neurotoxin that mimicked death. So then this person looked like they were dead, they get buried, and then they resurrect, and then they were utilizing other herbs that would allow for subjugation. And then in addition to that, you use psychological manipulation. So now that plus the trauma of like you wake up
Being buried.
buried
Yeah.
and understanding that there's already a cultural framework for, oh shit, you did something wrong, now you're a zombie, so you already know that you're in this state for a reason,
Mhm.
that this actually creates zombies. And he also agreed with her that this seems to be related to Haiti's unique experience of their colonialism and of their revolution. It does seem to be related to this feeling of having who you are taken because you of being enslaved. And he found that there's definitely like a we can trace the scientific way in which this is happening. But what you
Mhm.
can't do is just because you do those pieces, you can't have the same result of then you can just make a zombie anywhere because you need the cultural and spiritual beliefs to give reasoning as to what you're doing for even the person to be able to fall into that same manipulation. I think that's kind of similar to what you can do like in a cult setting, for instance. You
Mhm.
don't even have to have drugs. You can use environment and psychological manipulation, and that can change a person's behavior drastically. And people will
Oh,
do
yeah.
things that they would never say they would do. Like we
Absolutely.
can't discount that. So that's just like one little case study. And that's all for a same sort of like supernatural thing that what we would call supernatural, that somebody else would say this is just a part of my religion,
Mhm.
where there is scientific evidence, but I don't know that people, even if you show them all this, I don't know that people would be like, okay, so zombies are real. Because to get to that real place, you also need to be accepting that it's possible for there to be a cultural framework that allows for this. And if you
Right.
just don't have that model, how are you going to accept it?
How can you if you don't have that? You can't.
But that
You can't.
doesn't make it not real.
No. And that's I mean, you just summed up where I am, right? Like, I don't have that model, like you were saying earlier. I don't have that model for, what people are telling me Bigfoot is to them, right? Through their cultural framework or their frame of reference or, their experience, etc. I don't have that model to be able to do what that second scientist came in and did to make zombies, quote unquote, scientifically real, right?
Like provable.
I'm say that again. Sorry.
provable. Like he could prove
Yeah,
it
provable.
in a.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm,
I don't have that model, and that's where I need to get one way or the other with Bigfoot and the reports that are coming in that are closer to the supernatural. I need to understand, geographically, is there, are these balls of energy, caused by environmental factors? Is there, what is happening when people are having these feelings, or what is there something influencing them? It could be Bigfoot, right? I'm not excluding that, but what is this? How do I look at it to determine? Like he was you said ethnobotanist, is that right?
mhm, mhm,
So he understood, okay, these people, let's look at what's happening to them to make them zombies, and it was a neurotoxin, right? And then like some kind of paralytic maybe or whatever. And
mhm.
uh he was able to understand, okay, that this is how it's happening, and that's what I need to get to really. That's the biggest question for me, is how is this happening? What is happening when these reports come in? Because the more mundane reports, maybe for lack of a better word, would be like, I found a footprint. That's measurable. I can literally measure the footprint. I can make a cast of it. I can mark where it was. I can look at the dermal ridges in it. I can, you know, estimate how much that creature weighed, all of these things from one footprint. But from the report that comes in that tells me, Bigfoot, and told me something telepathically, I don't know how to use that. I don't know
Yeah.
how to use that, right? And, those don't come in frequently, but I would like to
Well,
understand the cultural side of that.
you could have a model that says, because that's a part of understanding also psychology. So maybe for them, it was something they heard audibly. So they heard this told me this. There's also an understanding that we have our own intuitiveness and our own sensory experience that is not always easily articulated,
Mm,
that we know has intelligence. I mean, we're learning more about this. Like this is related to when you have a feeling, like you walk down the street, you have a feeling
intuition.
that you should turn around. Yeah, you should
Yeah.
turn around. We have proven that what that really, like, if you want to say it as like a scientific explanation, what that is that many markers are being picked up in your subconscious, and that is informing a response. And
Right,
so before you sit there
evolutionarily,
and try to determine, right,
yes.
right, for a
Yeah,
reason, like for your protection.
yeah.
And that could be the same sort of thing. Like how can we say that we can do all of that? Because we know that we take in all kinds of stimuli, and basically our brain determines what you can handle, and it gives it to you based off of what you can handle. That's part of how our brain is working. So for one person, they may be able to handle an audible voice that they hear. Another person may not be able to deal with that. That's not going to
Yeah.
do anything for them.
I'll tell you right now, if I heard somebody else and I was in the woods alone, I'm often in the woods alone, as you know, right? If I heard somebody say, "Hey, Scott, like, you're doing great," I'd be gone. Gone. I
Which is
I
probably why you won't hear that.
right.
But to my earlier point about that in between space, I think you would be more open to it if you were in the woods alone and maybe you passed out, and as you were coming to, you heard it. You might be more open to it. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
I heard this.
I
For
would
you,
be.
that would work.
You're right. You're right.
And my point is the reason why you're more open to it is most likely has a lot more to do with, in our society, we have made a space for going between sleeping and waking as being a place where strange things can happen, between life and death. is where strange things can happen. We have space for that. In other words, we have a cultural framework that says that is totally possible. So if that happened to you, you passed out
Mm,
and you were coming to and you heard a voice, you probably wouldn't freak out as you would if you were just walking, because we don't
yeah.
have a structure where you can walk in the forest and have a conversation with something that you can't see, touch, feel. We don't have a structure for that.
No, and that's probably why it's so hard for a lot of people to accept these reports, right? Eh, including myself, because I don't have that like you've said all along. I don't have that structure for it. And one of the things that somebody said to me, and this person's definitely a scientist, like credentialed, published. I won't say their name because I don't want to misrepresent or misquote. But what I took away from our conversation, what they said to me was, we've done all these expeditions and uh, found all this evidence, and you know, one of them being we found this trackway that went out to a middle of a field and then just disappeared. How do you explain that? Scott, how do you explain that? Because you're following physical evidence that you accept as, you know, science, like you can analyze this, you accept this evidence, but why do you stop accepting that it just disappeared in the middle of the field? Or why do you stop there? And that's what really made me more curious about, like, okay, why would I say that it's not possible that it just stopped? Like I would, but it did, right? It did stop in that field, and it didn't backtrack,
Mhm,
or at least you can't tell if it did. It doesn't look like it did. So why do I just measure the footprints and accept that there's footprints there, and I don't look for the reason why they disappeared, and why they stopped in the middle of a field, and so I'm looking for how to find more. And this is not going to happen over the course of this conversation, right? This is just the beginning of my journey, because I struggle with this. I struggle. Like, I'm a hunter. I talk about it a lot. Like, I'm tracking a deer. It went here. It went here for this reason. This is their behavior. I understand deer. I understand animal behavior. I can predict this. I can find them. It's measurable. It's essentially repeatable for the most part, and
mhm,
it's documented. It's something you can learn and understand and repeat and be successful. But I can't do that with a set of tracks that just stops in the field and doesn't have an explanation for where it went. Like I just I struggle, and I acknowledge I struggle, and that's, I think, part of this podcast is that journey of pushing the boundaries, learning more, and just trying to give myself parameters to operate by so that at least I can be consistent. Because that's very important, right? I'm not going to get anywhere without any consistency. If I'm all over the place, what am I really going to accomplish?
they knew that our sun was a part of a dual star system before we figured this out as with our
Huh.
science. They knew about that. Um, but if you I was reading, there was a book, and I have it somewhere. They have in their culture, they had a person who it was their job to hold the oral history, and then they
Hmm.
passed that on, they died. And so there was one person who knew everything, and that was his only job. And this
Hmm.
anthropologist went and interviewed this person, and he told them the entire history of the world to the dawn, and it is like the most epic adventure you could imagine. Like most cosmologies are like this. It's like twins were born and they threw a sword and then the river spewed from them, like stuff that we'd be like, okay, that's fantastic. Like that's what it reads like. But they still have the knowledge embedded in there. So what I learned from some of this, like figuring out that these cosmologies we've kind of been taught to treat as literature and not as like real knowledge, they did carry very real knowledge. And in a
Yes.
way, it's smarter than what we've built with just having science, because we talked a little bit about us being a symbolic creature, but we are also a unique creature in that we have to have a story to make sense of anything. Like if I ask you what you did today, you will probably tell me a short story because that's how your brain works. So these cosmologies were really stories about all of these essential pieces of knowledge about how the world works. And they're not meant to just be kind of treated like, oh, that's like a cool little whatever, but it's not real. It has a lot of real things in there. This is part of how we kept passing that on and making sure that we did have some knowledge. So I think things like that, understanding that inside of there, encoded in some ways, or maybe sometimes said just plainly, are real pieces
Mhm.
of knowledge is a good like beginner. Like it's a beginning way to start to say, okay, if you and they do this sometimes in sort of like therapy type stuff too. If you tell me a story about a lot of things that seem like they're unrelated, what can I actually take out of this that is
Mhm.
probably a truth about you? Like, I think that's a good way to approach it. So if
That's
you're
exact
telling me
yeah.
that you see that, so if you're telling me that you experienced this Bigfoot and it teleported, and maybe what's most important is not the sequence of events and how possible they are. Maybe what's most important is what does that actually tell me about your experience? Which is a question I wouldn't know the answer to, but it's a good place to start because it depends on who's telling you. That's
Mm.
part of it. It's more contextualized than it's not going to be like you need the richness of who are you, how
Mhm.
do you see the world to better understand what they're trying to tell you. And embedded in there, most likely is some grain of truth that you can start to build an understanding around. Like, okay, because I don't see the world the way you do, I have to be able to see it this way. So I have to find this like egg that I can move over to my side and be like, this is where you live. I get it now. As opposed to, because you're probably never going to be able to see what they see, but you can
No, no, I
find
don't
that little bridge. You don't think so?
yeah, and as a
You don't think your
researcher,
Bigfoot's gonna teleport?
I don't know. I don't think that, but as a researcher, I'd like to be able to say I was objective in getting to that answer, right? Like, and did my utmost to take in all the evidence without cherry picking, without because I
Mhm,
mean, from a one of the things that I haven't said yet in the show is I'm trying to take a big data approach, right? So, and I describe it in the simplest terms is the more samples I get, the more that the most common trend is going to shine through in some analysis,
mhm.
right? Like so, those outliers, even though they may be correct or they maybe really did happen, they are going to fall out of the data set, and that's for my initial pass. I think that's the goal. Is I want to understand the consistent predictive behaviors, like I alluded to for deer earlier
Mhm.
where, the what, the when, the why, the how, all of those things. Because once we have that baseline, then we can extrapolate from there, right? And understand, okay, is this, oh, that it, this is happening because of this, and so on. So uh, I don't necessarily, I want all that data in the database, but I'm not worried about swaying the results one way or the other because with more and more samples, I'm still going to get to the truth. But the truth, just because those samples fall out, doesn't mean that they're not also true. You know what I mean? So I want as much data as
I
possible.
I would say that part of what you're doing, so the more quantitative approach is great for testing and refining theories. But when you're saying, "I want to get to the truth," that actually sounds like a better approach for that part of it would be like grounded theory, which is a qualitative research methodology which says, I don't know what the theory is yet. So first I have to collect.
Exactly.
And as I collect, then the themes start to emerge and then a theory can begin to form, which I think is
Exactly.
what you're talking about, like those data sets that are probably going to fall out. They're going to fall out of you're not going to be able, like right now you're probably working from that more scientific theory of like where does this fit in our are different animal kingdoms. Like that's what we know.
Mhm.
And there's definitely going to be data that falls out of that because of the uniqueness of these experiences. So that's going to be about testing that part. But the more like, but what else could this be? That's where a qualitative approach of the collection and the coding and the theming of those codes to start to surface a yet unknown truth can
Right.
be really helpful.
Ex- yes, you summarized it perfectly. Yes. This is exactly what I'm trying to get to, and trying to do both of those things at the same time, right? Um,
This is a lot of work.
so it's a lot of work. It unexpectedly has taught me a lot about a lot of different things doing this project. One of them, as we've talked about in this episode, is people's motivations, people's experiences, people's beliefs, people's insecurities, all of these things. Um, and I just wanted to take a moment to explore that because I spend a lot of time talking about technical map things, or how to do what plants to eat to survive, and how would Bigfoot forage. But a big, huge part of the equation is, how does Bigfoot influence human culture, and what do people believe about Bigfoot? And that's why I wanted to talk about that in this episode. And I think um, we might need a part two. I'm curious to see how they respond and what kind of questions I get, because um, we've covered a lot. And I think some of the stuff we talked about, believe it or not, is, I wouldn't say taboo in the Bigfoot community, but like it's sensitive. Some of it is
Like
sensitive.
what?
Like people like to acknowledging that there's people are at least having these experiences from a flesh and blood camp. For me to say, like, people are I'm not denying that they're having this experience. People are gonna be like, "Ah, he's paranormal now. He's saying it's possible. Ah, this guy," like they really are. They're gonna be like seriously. But I'll throw the disclaimer out there. Personally, I don't think that's Bigfoot. I don't think that's happening. But I cannot sit here as as a researcher. I am a scientist. I have a BS degree, so I technically am a scientist. And by background, I'm a geographer. It is a science. My wife and I had this argument. Geography is a science, Caroline. Um, she's like, I'm a geologist. That's a science. And I was like, geography is a science. She's
Oh,
like, no,
that's
it's
so
not.
true.
I was like, excuse me. But so I'm a scientist and a researcher, and I know that if I cherry pick evidence and cherry pick data, that's not uh
But there is a difference. There is a difference between saying, I don't like this data. We're just not going to include that. That's cherry picking.
yes,
Versus
true.
saying, I don't know what this is, which to me is science. Because one of the things I get frustrated with is that sometimes
Yeah.
people who are very deeply entrenched in their scientist identity forget that if you're a real scientist, you don't know anything 100%. You have to remember that we don't know everything there is to know about everything. So it's very possible that you have come across something that you don't know what it is, and that's okay. Like you're
Oh,
supposed to
no, that's
say, we don't know what this is. You're not supposed to say,
exactly.
you're lying to me.
No, no, and exactly, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, I'm very much on the same page where, I just think I know I'm gonna catch flack for even, like, there's people are gonna be like, "I can't believe you're, like, collecting this data." But I don't know what it is, right? I don't know why it's
Why not?
happening, and it is happening
Why
to people.
what kind of
People
scientist wouldn't collect the data? Like why if it's data, collect the data. It's not your
Yeah.
job to judge the data. You're supposed to collect the data.
No, you're right, and
That's
it's not
that's
an
that's the
abundant.
cherry picking.
Yeah, and it's truthfully, it's not an overwhelming part of the database, but it is happening. So if I wanted to talk about it because, I mean, and we talked about a lot, but a interesting part of it for me was the woo side, um, because I I don't often think about that when I think about Bigfoot in my personal approach. However, like you're saying, like it is happening. People are saying it's happening. Enough people are, reporting and going on shows and other podcasts and saying like this happened to me. So what is it? Like, and if I can understand that too, or if it is all part of the same phenomenon, then I want I want that data, because then I see the full picture, or I at least get that much closer to the full picture. So I don't know. It's such.
I mean, I think your point is also that you're not saying I don't like this must be the same as this other type of data. You're not saying that. You're just
Mm-mm,
saying I don't have the proper tools to fully exclude this because
no,
it hasn't
right,
been proven that it's not a piece of data that is informative to a generative theory about what Bigfoot even is. Like that's
exactly.
appropriate. That's appropriate. I don't
Yeah,
think
I
that
I agree.
because
I
somebody
just know. I know.
well, I'm just for those out there who are going to be given the flag, I'm reminding them that saying that what you're saying your experience is worthy of being investigated is not the same as saying I accept that blindly with no further questions and
Right,
we have no more provocation because whatever you told me must be the full truth. That's very different. And it
right,
is true that in a space where it's not as easy to point to a physical indicator, it's a lot easier to be manipulated because it is going to be more collectively understood. And I think that there are definitely going to be people who are falling into that where they're making claims that are more about attention or more
yes,
about
unfortunately.
camaraderie. And I think that that's fine. I feel like this is to me feels like a skill that exists between quote soft and quote hard sciences where there are ways to deal with this stuff that seems squishy and not so easy to categorize that are systematic and that are still evidence based. It doesn't
Mhm.
mean that if it's like if I can't measure it in the lab then therefore it just is weird. Like there is entire set of ways to deal with that. That needs to be done, which still allows for there to be because you can't generate a theory off of a feeling. So you have to have evidence. But the evidence will look different as far as you're not going to be able to just replicate that data set in the same sort of manner, but you can find other means of being able to validate, like what I was saying around is there a cultural framework for this that this person has a connection to that explains why they would have this experience? That has more validity than like,
Mhm.
hey, I heard about this on TV and I think it happened to me too. Like, no, that's not the same thing.
Right,
There
and
are
that's a
other
tough one.
indicators. Well, so there's a psychologist called Paul Ekman who teaches how to tell when people are lying. Obviously, you need to be able to see their face because we have micro expressions that are culturally and evolutionarily evolved that we can't change.
Mhm.
And that's one way to tell when people are lying. There are other tells, there are linguistic tells of when people are lying, especially in Western culture. So there's some ways to do it. They're not going to be like, if I did this, it's the same as saying like I measured it to be 6 inches and it's really 5.8. Like that's not the same, but there are
Right.
definitely going to be thresholds that you can utilize to be able to say I have more confidence that this is true versus not true. Like those things
Right, and maybe
exist.
weight
You can
that.
use statistics. Yes, they're just you can use statistics to do this. It's not like it has to be super hard, but I think there's also this easy dismissal of things that certain scientists are uncomfortable doing because it's not a part of their canon. So then they're just like, well, it must not be for real, which is just untrue. And in my opinion, a little bit lazy because all you have to do is ask or go Google or like find somebody who does this for a living. There's plenty of people out there who do, and maybe be a little more open to learning because I think that's part of the problem that there's not as much willingness for to learn something that is unfamiliar to them, not necessarily unknown. To be able to analyze things that are not they this is more like how you build something from the bottom up. That is not typically how a lot of people who brand themselves scientists, that's not how they work.
Right.
They're just utilizing things that are already proven. So that this makes sense why you're not used to it. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong or that it's completely junk or whatever. The human experience requires context. We aren't supposed to just be like stick figures with no souls walking around with nothing to do or say except for what is predictable. There's other aspects of what it means to be a person that are not about those things. And I think
Right.
if you talk to just a regular human, they would validate that that's true. And I think when it comes to trying to understand a human interaction, you need that. That's something that will help to bring clarity and make it easier to understand what a real lie is, so that there needs to be robustness in being able to study those things and be able to build models for those things that will allow that data set to live in the same place. Like that should be the approach, not just you went to the other side.
Right. Right. On that note, I'm gonna I did not just go to the other side, but I'm I'm learning. I'm learning and I'm doing the work so that I can do a more thorough, complete analysis and really do my best. I mean, that's what this podcast is about. That's what the project is about. It's about curiosity. It's about learning. That's why I put these out. And I may have described this to you. The whole idea of this Mapping Bigfoot podcast. Obviously, it is map based. Most of some of the content, but what I really like doing with it is bringing people like yourself who may not be versed in Bigfoot per se, not have an interest in it, not ever, really put thought to whether Bigfoot is real or not, may not even care, right? Not to say you don't care, but like just in general, uh, bring people like you who have this expertise, this knowledge in so that we get out of these outside and we break out of these echo chambers that are in the community where it's just reinforcing, you know, this is, this is this way and Bigfoot does this because this, and you know what I mean? I want to look at it as if I'm looking at it for the first time with none of this, um, what's the word? With no assumptions uh, about anything. And that's what I'm trying to do is build a database, analyze it that way, every way I know how, and learn new ways to do that. And that is why people like you coming onto the show, experts like you, really, I hope, broadens people's horizons, opens some opinions, starts some good conversations, and really makes people think about what Bigfoot is, what research really means, what the scientific method is, all the different disciplines that there are under the umbrella of science, not just what they accept as, hard science or whatever, right? So I'm grateful for you coming on the show. And I always end with I'd like to make sure I'm as thorough as possible. Is there anything that you wanted to cover that I didn't ask a question about, or that want to that you're working on that you want to plug on the show? It doesn't have to be Bigfoot related. It's just your work. Um, anything that we didn't touch on that you want to mention, promote, say, anything.
One thing we didn't really get to, which maybe if we do a part two, we talk more about, is folklore and the place
Mm,
that it has in this, and also just what it has for humans in general. There's a lot there that we could dig into.
okay,
I don't
I'll
really
note.
have a specific thing that I want to plug. I will say I have been for the last few months working on building an evaluation framework for the plenary, which you mentioned in my bio, and that has made this kind of opening up that you're talking about you're doing, I've been having a more like reimagining of what it looks like to do research because the plenary does events and they can
Mm,
sometimes be big events. They call them showcases. And the whole purpose is to bring people together and have them do something or experience something they normally wouldn't, take science and take away the prestige and let them get their hands dirty, be able to use art as a way to start to investigate things that they maybe are afraid of. It is not easy to try to
mm.
evaluate those types of things with a typical framework because it needs to fit so much. So I've spent a lot of time lately reading through things and trying to basically you have to kind of create, which was fun too, to figure out how to make something that's actually true in the sense of like this is what really happens and we need to be able to capture that data versus standardized, which is
Mm,
typically what happens where you have to sanitize your what you really want to say down to like the accepted version.
right.
And there's a lot of tension there, and it sounds similar to what you're saying. So I feel your pain a bit of trying to there's always this pull to want to be academic enough and do the respectable work, but there's also this need to just fill in the gap of, but this is happening. So what do we
Yeah, it's a
do? So
struggle.
I get
It's a
that.
real struggle, and
Hmm.
that's been the undercurrent of our conversation tonight, right? Um, one of them, and it's just like it is a struggle, and it's interesting to hear that you're experiencing that in a different way, but like a similar struggle where I mean, essentially, you said it's like, okay, this is the standardized, this is the acceptable, versus this is the true. What's happening? This is happening, and that's exactly what I'm experiencing. I mean, it's
Hmm.
crazy how it is pervasive, right? It permeates science, if you will, right? It permeates all of science. So I just want to say, in that case, um, thank you for coming on. I think this is a
Yeah, this is
very
fun.
it's a very different episode from the way that I normally do things because I usually have a much more structured outline, but this is not my expertise. So I wanted to let the conversation flow naturally. Um, and I think we really touched on a lot of interesting things. I certainly adjusted my perspective, learned a lot, and really, I can't wait to re-listen to this. So things also, you know, how you just hear things a second time or a third time, and you're like, ah, that's okay. That's what the context was. Because I'm also, in as a host, I'm also trying to make sure, we navigate the whole show. So I'm always listening, but it doesn't always sink in the best either. So I can't wait to listen to this again, and then realize like, oh, that's what that's what she meant. And I totally thought it was this, or like, oh, that applies even more this way. Like I can't wait to listen to it again because I feel like it was a deep show. Um,
We
to,
didn't
to
even go deep, deep. We just went one
no,
level deep
yeah, we went. I mean, I've got to do this in stages. You know me personally. Like I've got to work to the deep. I've got to work to the deep end. Like
to the deep, deep, to
yeah,
the to the
boys.
blind animals in the ocean deep.
Yeah, yeah. This is like it's a few steps. I got to dip my toe first, but no, this was great, and I'm very grateful to have that you took the time to sit down away from your family and have a chat about Bigfoot and what it means to be humans searching for Bigfoot and all the things in between. So, Astrid, thank you very much. I owe you some gumbo.
This was
I'm
fun. Ooh,
volunteering Caroline. She's gonna get so mad because I always volunteer her for gumbo.
my sister
She's
just
so
made
good at it.
some,
I don't have anything like that to offer her, so,
so
maybe
you
she'll
just
teach
offer
me.
her.
Yeah, exactly. It's the beauty of being married.
Oh, I know. I got a husband who does stuff like that too. I totally get it.
Exactly, so, anyway, thank you very much.